Look at that scorched neck, Kyle spat with a laugh, jerking his chin toward the old man at the end of the line. Reynolds looks like scrap that wandered into the wrong place. In this camp, someone like him belongs on a stretcher, in an ambulance. He shoved hard, snickers spreading like a spark. The whole camp turning to watch, waiting to see who would fall first. Just as Kyle was about to shove again, the alarm lights suddenly flickered off. Rhythm. And in that instant, the thing Kyle despised most abruptly shifted direction. Red light swept across the yard. Reynolds stepped forward, half a pace, his hoarse voice cutting straight into the air. You ever know what it feels like to be hunted? Let me teach you. Kyle froze, eyes wide. No one understood how a thin old man could stand that solid, as if he had survived places someone like Kyle did not have the imagination to picture. Then Voss appeared. No introduction, no glance around, walking straight to Reynolds and leaning in close to his ear, dropping a single sentence that froze the entire space. Black Ops survivor. Just one sentence. That was enough for Kyle to understand he had just touched the kind of man the entire system wanted buried without a trace. So who exactly is Reynolds? Why would a general step in? And what in this old soldier's past is enough to make an entire camp hold its breath? If this scene made you feel angry, subscribe now, because what comes next is even more suffocating. And leave a comment, whose side would you choose? Morning at the training camp began like every other morning. The whistle rang out through air still wet with dew, the sound dry and cold, cutting through the unfinished sleep of those who had not yet grown used to the rhythm of life here. 5:10 a.m. The sky was clear, but the air was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. People lined up, stood with straight backs, looked forward, and believed that the order before their eyes was the only thing worth believing in. Elias Reynolds stood at the end of the line. He was 58 years old. At that age, most people of his generation had left training grounds like this long ago, or at least no longer had to stand still waiting for a whistle in the cold mist. Reynolds stood there, thin-framed, his shoulders slightly sloped, his white t-shirt already soaked with sweat and clinging to his back. He did not look like a recruit, nor did he look like an instructor. He looked like an old piece, mistakenly placed into a new picture. The young recruits standing in front of and beside him began to glance at him. At first, it was only curiosity, then it gradually shifted into discomfort. There was something about Reynolds that made them uneasy. Maybe because he was far older than they were, maybe because he stood too still, or because he carried none of the eagerness or fear like the others. Kyle Mercer was the one who broke the silence. When the morning light became just strong enough to shine on the formation, the dark burn scar on Reynolds' neck appeared clearly. Kyle tilted his head, stared for a few seconds, as if to make sure he was not mistaken, then laughed. His laughter rang out more clearly than necessary, drawing the attention of the entire line. "Did you get roasted?" Kyle said, his voice half joking, half deliberate. "Or did you burn your own life?" A few scattered laughs followed, not very loud, but enough to form an invisible wall. Reynolds did not turn around. He did not look at Kyle, nor did he respond. He only raised his hand and pulled his collar lower, covering the darkened skin. In that moment, his hand trembled very slightly. It was not the tremor of fear, but the reflex of a body that had passed through too many cold mornings like this. Reynolds clenched his hand, and the tremor disappeared immediately. Noah Grant stood not far from him and saw that detail. Noah said nothing, only glanced at Reynolds once more, his gaze lingering longer than that of the others. The whistle sounded again. Instructor Pike stepped out in front of the formation, his voice hoarse and sharp, as if the morning had already irritated him before he saw anyone. Pike did not spend time observing individual faces. He looked at the entire line as a single mass, then spoke. "Anyone who can't keep up, get out," Pike said. "This camp doesn't raise old men." Kyle turned his head and glanced at Reynolds, the corner of his mouth lifting. A few other recruits also turned to look, as if to confirm the subject of the remark. Reynolds stood still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He did not lower his head, nor did he appear offended. If anything changed, it was only that his gaze darkened slightly, very hard to notice. The run began. The formation moved, shoes striking the concrete and forming a steady rhythm. Reynolds did not surge forward, nor did he fall behind. He maintained a stable pace, enough to breathe, enough to observe what was around him. He did not look at the ground, nor did he look at the sky. His eyes swept across small movements, slight breaks in rhythm that were easy to overlook. A young recruit ran out of breath after the first few laps, his steps starting to stagger. Reynolds moved alongside him, tilted his head, and spoke quietly, his voice low and even. "Don't burn gas in the first minutes." The recruit looked up at Reynolds, paused slightly, then nodded very quickly and adjusted his running rhythm. There was no thank you. It was not necessary. Kyle pushed past from behind. When running through the sand pit, he deliberately slammed into Reynolds' shoulder, hard enough to create contact but not enough to be called out. "Sorry," Kyle said, his voice casual. "My hands are slippery." Reynolds slowed by half a beat, kept his balance, and did not look at Kyle. He replied with a short sentence. "Yeah, slippery." The sentence carried no mockery and no challenge. It fell amid the sound of running shoes and heavy breathing, light as a small pebble. Kyle kept running, but the expression on his face changed. The joke did not bring the sense of victory he had expected. At the short break, the formation scattered. People bent down to drink water, breathing hard, trying to bring their heart rate back down. Noah picked up his canteen, shook it lightly, then frowned when he heard nothing. Reynolds had already crouched down, lifted his canteen, shaken it once more, and clearly heard the dry emptiness. He set the canteen on the ground, his eyes quickly shifting westward, toward the row of old warehouses hidden behind the steel fence. The look lasted only a moment, but it was enough to mark itself in his mind. Noah followed that look, about to ask, but Reynolds had already turned away, as if nothing had happened. Near the training field, the training schedule board stood ready. One line had been crossed out and corrected with red pen, the ink still fresh. Reynolds stopped in front of the board for exactly 1 second. He scanned it, enough to recognize the change, enough to understand that it had not been part of the original plan. A familiar feeling rose within him, the feeling of someone who had realized he was being pushed into a test prepared in advance. The whistle sounded again. Pike stepped out to the center of the field, his face showing no emotion. He swept his eyes across the formation, then stopped on Reynolds. The look was not long, but it was clear, like a period placed in the right spot. Pike lowered his voice and spoke more slowly than usual. "There is a special exercise tonight, reserved for those who like to play the hero." No one spoke. No one asked anything. Reynolds stood still at the end of the line, his expression unchanged. In the air, something had just been locked into place, like a lock already fitted with a key, waiting for the right time to be turned. The next training session began while the entire team's bodies were still tense from the morning run. Their breathing had not yet returned to normal when a new command was thrown out, decisive and cold. Sweat dried on the skin and was immediately drawn out again, creating a faint dragging sensation with every movement. Reynolds stepped into his position, neither slow nor rushed. He did not need to look at Pike to know what the next drill would be. The way the formation was arranged, the way the instructors stood offset on both sides, said enough. The wall climb was called. The wall was tall, the surface rough. The handholds looked evenly spaced at a glance, but one wrong placement was enough to slip. Noah climbed before Reynolds, following the proper order. He climbed fast in the early section, slightly hasty, like many young people when they want to prove they are no worse than anyone else. Near the top, Noah's hand slipped from the hold because of sweat and uneven pulling force. His body jerked sharply. The natural reflex was to lift his head, unconsciously, searching for another grip. Reynolds had seen that moment before it happened. He stepped up one beat, grabbed the back of Noah's collar, and yanked him down hard. His breath burst out rough and tight, not from exhaustion, but from focus. "Don't look up. Look at your hands." The voice was not loud, but strong enough to cut through panic. Noah lowered his eyes, regripped the old hold, his hand trembling lightly before stabilizing. When he climbed over the top edge of the wall and slid down the other side, Reynolds kept his grip for one more beat to be sure. He let go, guided Noah's landing, then stepped back and returned the position to the next position. There was no nod, no praise. Everything happened neatly, like a reflex repeated over many years. At the foot of the wall, Kyle stood clapping slowly, each sound landing separately. He laughed, stretching his voice, saying the old man was really good. "Grandpa, so why wasn't he always that good back then?" A few laughs broke out, familiar, like a collective habit. Reynolds did not turn around. He bent down, pulled Noah's harness, strapped tighter, adjusted a misaligned latch. The movement quick and precise. He spoke quietly, saying that pulling this strap one more notch would be more secure. Noah nodded, still breathing hard, his eyes lingering on Reynolds a little longer. The drills continued, stations changing faster than usual. Pike made the team switch early, then kept them at another station longer than expected. When the water break was called unusually early, a few people looked up in surprise. Reynolds glanced at the clock hanging on the wall of the nearby warehouse. The second hand was still moving evenly, and nothing appeared wrong. He muttered very softly, only loud enough for himself to hear, that they were changing the rhythm. Noah stood nearby and heard it, turning to look at him, curiosity clear in his eyes. At the mud pit, the team had to crawl low beneath ropes, stretched tight to the ground. Mud clung to sleeves, to necks, to faces, making everything heavy and slick. Reynolds crawled slower than a few people ahead of him, not because he was weak, but because he needed to look. When his hand touched a section of rope, the sensation traveling up his fingertips was different. He stopped, felt it again, and realized the outer layer was worn far beyond normal. Reynolds turned to Noah, his voice firm and concise. "Don't touch that." Noah stopped instinctively, his heart pounding. He asked quietly if Reynolds knew beforehand. Reynolds flicked his eyes at the rope once more, then replied, "I recognized the smell." The answer did not explain, and did not reassure, but Noah did not need more. He crawled around in another direction, avoided that section of rope, and felt that he had just avoided something he had not yet been able to name. On the opposite side, Kyle saw the scene. He pulled his group closer, his voice deliberately louder than necessary, saying the old man was just acting. Old people liked being pitied. A few laughs rang out, then died faster than in the morning. The sound faltered, lacking confidence. The eyes of several people lingered on Reynolds longer, as if they were weighing the words against what had just happened. The training stretched into late afternoon. Fatigue clung to every movement, making muscles gradually heavier. Reynolds kept an even pace, not passing anyone, and not letting anyone fall too far ahead. When someone slipped, he moved alongside. When someone slowed, he reduced his pace as well. He did not need to give long commands. His presence was enough for a few people to adjust themselves, even if they had not yet realized why. Noah began to notice more. He realized that Reynolds always looked before his hands touched, always listened before he stepped. These were things not taught aloud, yet they appeared at exactly the right moments, just enough to avoid mistakes that could cost injuries. Trust formed slowly, bit by bit, without needing a declaration. Kyle was different. Each time he saw other people's eyes linger on Reynolds longer, he felt irritated. The authority he was used to holding through laughter and mockery began to thin. He talked more, laughed louder, as if volume could cover the sensation of his grip slipping. At the end of the session, the internal speaker crackled, once off beat, then fell silent for a few seconds. Pike read out the night training order, his voice steady and cold. When he reached Reynolds' name, he emphasized each syllable clearly. "Reynolds, present at 0100. The sound dropped onto the field like a seal, closing the day session and opening another door, waiting for the exact time to turn the key. That morning showed no unusual signs. The light came faster than usual, the sun rose early, and the training field was dry. The formation was rearranged after the night exercise. The recruits took their familiar positions, fatigue still hanging loosely in their eyes. Reynolds stood at the end of the line as on previous days. No one asked him to, and no one questioned it. His presence had become something strange yet gradually familiar, like an object that did not belong but had not yet been removed. Footsteps sounded from the direction of the camp gate. The pace was neither hurried nor hesitant. Pike turned his head first, his back straightening by reflex. A few other instructors shifted aside. There was no assembly command, no introduction. The man stepped onto the field in a neatly pressed uniform. Tall, broad-shouldered, his graying hair combed cleanly. On his chest, insignia and medals were arranged neatly, neither excessive nor lacking. General Harlan Voss. He moved past the formation as if walking past inanimate objects. His gaze swept quickly, stopping on no face, checking no posture, making no assessment. The recruits held their positions, but their breathing slowed instinctively. Someone like Voss did not need to give orders to create pressure. His presence alone was enough. Voss walked slowly and straight, as if he knew exactly where he needed to stop. He passed almost the entire formation, then stopped in front of Reynolds. The distance between them was just enough to hear each other's breath. Reynolds lifted his head, his gaze neither avoiding nor challenging. He stood a little straighter, as if his body adjusted itself when encountering something very old. Voss leaned in close, bringing his mouth near Reynolds' ear. His voice was not loud, even low, but each syllable was clear. Black Ops, Survivor. The words did not echo through the air, but they spread very quickly. Reynolds felt his neck stiffen for a brief moment, like a reflex triggered by a sound once tied to survival. He did not step back. He looked up, his expression unchanged, only his eyes darkening, as if someone had just switched off a light inside him. "I am no longer anything of yours," Reynolds said. His voice was even, neither high nor low. It was not resistance, and not a plea, just a sentence placed exactly where it belonged. Voss's lip lifted very slightly, a movement that almost did not exist unless one looked closely. "That's not for you to decide," he replied. The words fell easily, like a self-evident truth. Pike stood nearby, motionless like a statue. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. not participating, not reacting. Kyle stood in the line and swallowed dryly. His eyes were fixed on Reynolds, as if he had just seen another shadow fall over the man he thought he understood. There was no laughter, no mockery, only a sudden, unfamiliar silence. Noah stood a few positions away, did not hear the full exchange, but heard enough to catch the first two words. He turned and whispered, "Black Ops, what is that?" The question slipped out very softly, carrying curiosity more than fear. Reynolds cut him off immediately, without turning his head. "Not your business." His voice was brief and final, sealing every opening. Voss straightened. He looked at Reynolds one more time, his gaze as if measuring something beneath the surface. His hand rose and touched the face of the watch on his wrist, fingers resting on the metal rim, as if checking his own heartbeat. His voice dropped lower, almost a private reminder, "Don't make things worse." Reynolds did not answer. He held his gaze forward, unbroken. In his mind, the training camp began to change shape. Familiar spaces started to close in, as if invisible walls were being raised. Voss turned away. He left the formation with the same measured steps that had brought him in, without looking back. The pressure remained hanging in the air after he disappeared. Pike cleared his throat and signaled for the formation to disperse, his voice returning to its familiar cadence. But something was off. The recruits began to murmur, questions swallowed halfway. Kyle looked at Reynolds once more, his eyes no longer as sharp as before. He wanted to say something, but could not find any words that fit. Noah looked back at Reynolds, but this time he did not ask. He realized some questions should not be asked here. The afternoon passed under a heavy weight. The training schedule was changed repeatedly, but no one explained why. Reynolds noticed the instructors beginning to look at him more often, yet avoiding direct interaction. He moved across the field like a reference point everyone had to account for, and yet wanted to avoid. By evening, the schedule board in the main building was locked. The display now required a new passcode. Pike stood in front of it, waited for everyone to disperse, then turned to Reynolds. His eyes were cold, his voice low, like reading out a verdict signed in advance. "From now on, you train on a separate schedule." Reynolds nodded very slightly. No questions, no reaction. He turned away, his steps slow but steady. Behind him, the training camp closed like a cage, just locked tight, and the key was no longer in his hands. The night alarm sounded when most of the barracks had sunk into a state halfway between exhaustion and sleep. The sound was not as decisive as usual. There was a slower beat, off by half a second, enough for those familiar with it to sense that something was wrong, but not enough to stop and think. Emergency lights snapped on along the corridors, red light sweeping across concrete walls, reflecting off faces that had not yet fully woken. Orders came through the internal speakers, the voice distorted and urgent, repeating a short command. "Move, move." The whole group of recruits burst out of the sleeping quarters, shoes pounding against cement in a chaotic rhythm. Reynolds ran with them, neither leading nor falling behind. The flashing red lights flattened and warped everything, making real distances hard to judge. Kyle ran ahead, turned his head, and shouted over his shoulder, "Run, old man. Don't slow us down." His voice rang sharp and harsh, mixing with the heavy breathing of the others. The direction of movement was led straight toward the west side of the camp. Reynolds realized it from the very first turn. The row of old warehouses appeared under the emergency lights. Low concrete blocks, rusted steel doors, lying silent as if forgotten. In Reynolds's mind, the daytime warning flashed back clearly. He ran while glancing toward the largest steel door, his voice bursting out by reflex. "Don't lean against that." But his words were swallowed by the alarm siren and the rush of footsteps. No one turned to look. The warehouse door opened. The whole group flooded inside. Before they could regain their bearings, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound of metal striking the frame rang out dry and heavy, like a slap straight across the face. The red light from outside vanished. Inside was pitch dark, only weak points of light from personal flashlights snapping on in haste. The air changed instantly. Heavy breathing sounded close to the R's, shoes scraping against concrete, people muttering curses in panic. One recruit rushed to the door and slammed it with both hands. Open it," he shouted, his voice breaking from strain. No answer came. Pike did not appear. There was no instructor's voice. No. Next command. Outside. Complete silence, as if no one stood behind that door. Reynolds stood still in the darkness, listening. He did not look at the door. He listened for very small sounds, sounds others missed because of panic. The metal is cooling after the impact, and the faint vibration of electrical wires somewhere below, nearly impossible to hear without focus. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old folding knife. The blade snapped open, steel flashing for a brief moment in the flickering flashlight beams. Kyle saw it and snorted in the dark. "You brought a toy." His voice trembled slightly, but he still tried to keep the familiar mockery. Reynolds did not answer. He knelt on the warehouse floor, his hand resting on the surface, moving slowly and sure. He searched for a narrow gap, a shallow depression almost impossible to notice if one did not know to look. The knife pried at the edge of a floor panel, metal giving a very soft sound. Reynolds lifted his head and raised a hand in signal. "Quiet. Listen." The group slowed instinctively. In that moment of silence, another sound emerged. A faint electrical hiss, steady and continuous, coming from beneath the floor. It was not loud, but enough to signal something that should not be here. A few people glanced around, swallowing hard. No one spoke. Reynolds pried the panel open. A stream of colder air rose from below. He shone his light down, the beam sweeping across metal steps, leading into a narrow space. The first thing he noticed was not an exit, but an unusually clean surface. The dust here had been swept away, revealing fresh handprints on the metal. Reynolds paused for a beat, exhaled slowly, then said, "Someone went down here today." The words dropped into the darkness, heavier than the door slam earlier. A few recruits stepped back by reflex. Kyle did not laugh anymore. Noah stood close to Reynolds, looking down into the opening, a chill running along his spine. There was no time to argue. Reynolds signaled one by one for them to climb down. He did not rush them, and he did not reassure them. He stood in a position just sufficient to control the pace. When it was Kyle's turn, he hesitated for half a second, then had no choice but to follow. Figures disappeared beneath the floor, one after another, metal creaking softly under each shift of weight. Reynolds went last. He pulled the panel back just enough to block the light, then moved through the low tunnel, his shoulders brushing against cold metal walls. No one spoke. Breathing was kept as low as possible. The tunnel led out behind the warehouse, where the ground was still damp. When Reynolds pushed the final barrier aside, bright white light suddenly poured in. The whole group crawled out. The yard behind the warehouse was lit by floodlights, so bright it made their eyes ache. They stood there, backs still bent from crawling out, not yet able to straighten before having to squint against the light. General Harlan Voss was waiting. He stood beside an empty ambulance, its engine running steadily. The rear doors were partly open, the inside completely dark. Voss did not step forward, and he did not speak right away. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the door, his calm gaze moving over each person as if counting heads. There was no surprise, no questions. Everything looked as if it had been calculated in advance. Reynolds straightened, the light hitting his face directly. In that moment, he understood very clearly. This was not a drill. This was a trap prepared beforehand, with an entrance, an exit, and even transportation waiting. The air around him grew heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the awareness that had just taken shape. Voss looked at Reynolds, his gaze lingering a little longer, as if confirming something in his mind. The ambulance behind him continued to idle, the engine steady and patient, waiting for the moment it would be needed. The next morning came earlier than Reynolds had hoped, not because he slept little, but because his sleep was incomplete. Fragments of the night at the old warehouse to the west still hung in his mind, like a room whose door had not yet been closed. When the morning whistle sounded, Reynolds had already been awake for quite some time. He washed his face with cold water, looked at himself in the steam-clouded mirror, then turned away before that image could become familiar. The summons came quickly and cleanly. No reason was given. A young soldier stood outside the sleeping quarters, read Reynolds's name, then gestured for him to follow. The young man's eyes avoided direct contact, like someone assigned a task but unwilling to know its outcome. Reynolds nodded, straightened his shirt, and followed. He did not ask where they were going. In his mind, the answer had already appeared. The sealed room was in the old administrative wing, a short distance from the main training area. The door closed behind Reynolds with a dry bitu. Final sound. Inside, there were no windows, no coffee, no water, only the steady hum of air conditioning and a metal table so clean it felt impersonal. The room carried the sense of having been wiped down very carefully, not to receive guests, but to ensure no trace of any previous conversation remained. General Harlan Voss was already seated on the other side of the table. He did not stand, did not invite Reynolds to sit. He only looked at him as if facing an item to be processed. Reynolds pulled out a chair and sat down, back straight, hands resting on his thighs. He did not let his eyes wander. He knew this room was designed so that no point of attention could be found. Voss took out a sheet of paper from beside him. No heading, no seal, no signature. He placed it on the tabletop and nudged it lightly toward Reynolds. The paper slid a short distance and stopped exactly between the two of them. "Sign it," Voss said. His voice was calm, like suggesting an administrative formality. copy. Then you'll be left alone. Reynolds did not look down at the paper right away. He kept his eyes on Voss's face, studying it carefully. At this distance, he saw details others often missed. The fine wrinkles at the corners of the eyes, the faint darkness beneath the lids, a fatigue carefully concealed. Reynolds drew in a short breath, then asked, left alone, for whom Voss's lips lifted in a very slight smile. The smile did not last, not enough to be called friendly. For everyone, he replied. For the camp, for you, for history. The final word was released more slowly, like a layer laid over the ones before it. Reynolds heard it and understood. He lowered his head and looked at the paper for the first time. The page was bare, clean, like a promise that everything could be written again in a different way. Reynolds looked up. His gaze did not waver. You call killing people history? The question carried no outrage, and it was not an accusation. It was placed like a test to see which way Voss would choose to answer. Voss did not get angry. He leaned back in his chair, raised a hand to touch the watch on his wrist. His fingers tightened around the metal rim for a very brief beat, then released. The gesture was small, but it did not escape Reynolds's notice. When Voss spoke again, his voice was slightly lower, no longer carrying the earlier administrative tone. You speak, Voss said, and it's not just me who falls. Something bigger falls with it. The air in the room thickened. The air conditioner continued its steady hum, but Reynolds felt the change clearly. Voss was not threatening crudely. He was placing a scenario on the table, a chain of consequences stretching beyond the two men facing each other. This was not a plea, and not an ultimatum. It was a reminder that real power rarely stands alone. Reynolds leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He recalled the empty ambulance from the night before, its engine running steadily, as if accustomed to waiting. He remembered the fresh handprints beneath the warehouse floor, the dust carefully swept away. All of it said the same thing. This had been prepared, not for a training exercise, but for an ending acceptable to those who did not want the truth to exist. You're afraid of losing control, Reynolds said evenly. Not afraid of me. Voss looked at him for a moment longer. His gaze did not change, but his jaw tightened slightly. There was no direct answer. The silence stretched for a few seconds, long enough for Reynolds to know he had touched the right point. Reynolds reached out and pushed the paper back to the center of the table. The motion was slow and final. I won't sign. His voice was dry, without emphasis. Voss followed the paper with his eyes, then looked back at Reynolds. He nodded very slightly, as if he had anticipated this outcome from the moment he entered the room. No disappointment, no surprise, just confirmation. 0100 tonight, Voss said. You alone. The words were set down on the table like a heavy object. Reynolds did not ask what 0100 was for. He stood, slid the chair back into its original position. Before turning away, he looked at Voss one last time. In that gaze, there was no challenge and no expectation, only the clarity of someone who had just refused the easier path. The door of the sealed room opened, then closed behind Reynolds. The hallway was brighter than the room he had just left, but no sense of relief followed. He walked on, each step even. In his mind, another lock had just been closed, solid and cold, waiting for 0100 to turn. If you have followed this story to this point, do not stop. What comes next will not give Reynolds more time to think, and it will not give you room to breathe. Continue, because some choices only fully reveal themselves when the price is placed on the table. 0100 a.m. The camp felt hollowed out. No voices, no scattered footsteps, no rushed breathing like during the day. Only wind cutting across the yard, and white, blue floodlights sweeping over patches of ground as if searching for something left behind. Reynolds was woken by a short, blunt knock on the door. Without explanation, the soldier read his name, then stepped aside, his eyes touching Reynolds for half a second before turning away, as if looking too long might cause trouble. Reynolds adjusted his jacket, pulled the zipper up to his neck, and followed the familiar path leading toward the training tower. The tower emerged in the darkness, tall and cold, its metal surface throwing the floodlight into sharp, folded lines. Wind struck his face directly, the smell of iron, rust, and night rushing in, reminding him of nights like this. In places very far away, at the base of the tower, Noah was standing, a safety harness wrapped around his body, the carabiner locked firmly into the anchor. His helmet sat slightly crooked, the wind making the strap tap lightly against his jaw. Pike stood beside him, clipboard in hand, feet planted like someone who had been standing there a long time. "Climb faster," Pike shouted, his voice torn into pieces by the wind but still strong enough to push Noah into motion. Noah placed his foot on the first rung, the metal vibrating lightly under his weight. Reynolds stood below, his eyes never leaving the rigging. Noah climbed 2 more rungs, his body tilting as a strong gust hit. He looked down. That look did not name anything clearly, but it was enough for Reynolds to see the question hanging in his eyes. This right. Is it safe? Can I continue? Reynolds stepped forward 1 pace, his breath turning into thin vapor. "Stop," he barked, the sound bursting out like a survival reflex. Pike spun around, his face tightening. "You don't have the authority to give orders here." He jerked his head, signaling Noah. "Continue." Noah hesitated for exactly 1 beat, then grabbed the next rung. Reynolds focused on the locking pin. The metal reflected the floodlight in an abnormal way, distorted in a direction it should not be, not evenly bright like a healthy lock. The reflected color was duller, the angle slightly off. He stepped forward, half a pace more. That lock snap. The sound was thin, small, dry, so clean that without focus one might think it was someone snapping a fingernail, but it was not. The load-bearing line severed right at the lock. No sagging, no warning sound beforehand. Noah fell straight down. No scream, no reflex. His body cut across the floodlight and slammed into the metal floor in a fall too sudden to measure. The wind surged harder, tearing the breath from those who witnessed it. 1 second of absolute silence. No wind, no voices, no metal, only the silence of a newly opened void. Then screams burst out from several directions at once. Someone ran forward. Someone stepped back. Pike shouted, his voice sharp as steel. "Accident. Everyone back." The order tried to smother the chaos, but the chaos still leapt inside every pair of eyes. Kyle stood a few meters away. His face had gone pale. His lips moved, the words breaking out like a fractured breath. "No, no way." It was as if a former joke had twisted into something no one had intended. He stepped back, but his footing failed, the retreat turning into a startled, directionless jolt. Reynolds did not stand watching. He dropped to his knees, his hand touching the cold ground. He picked up the severed end of the safety line lying beside Noah. His fingers touched the cut surface. The cut was flat, clean, not frayed, a precise slice. Reynolds stared for a long time. The floodlight shone straight down, leaving no shadow to hide in. He tilted his head and looked again, as if to be sure he was not imagining it. He tried to speak. His jaw opened, but no sound came out. His throat felt pulled tight from the inside. His chest rose and fell without forming words. The line slipped from his hand and hit the ground for the first time. The sound, light and cold. Reynolds bent down and picked it up again. This time, his movement was slower, heavier, his fingers trembling slightly as they closed around the length oath F line. Around him, voices overlapped. Someone called for medics. The words tangled in the wind. Someone staggered back, unsure where they were standing. Pike turned away, saying something into his radio, half the sentence torn away by the wind. Kyle remained frozen where he stood, his eyes locked on the severed line in Reynolds' hand, breathing fast and shallow. Reynolds stood up, his hand still holding the broken line. He lifted his head, and at that moment, his eyes caught a figure standing at the edge of the light. General Harlan Voss. He stood still, did not step forward, did not flinch, did not avoid the gaze. The floodlight struck him at an angle, casting a long edge of shadow stretching across the ground. One hand rested on the opposite wrist, his thumb touching the metal face of his watch. He did not check the time. He only touched it, as if marking a moment. Reynolds remained still, did not move closer. The wind shifted, snapping his jacket hard. The length of the line in his hand swayed lightly with the gust. Voss looked at him for a few more seconds, his gaze carrying neither anger nor compassion. He leaned very slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Now it's your turn." Reynolds did not answer. His lips did not move. His body did not shift. The broken line remained in his hand, growing colder in the wind. Footsteps behind him wavered. Metal on the tower continued to vibrate faintly. The wind shifted again, stronger. The floodlight shone down onto the yard, stretching Reynolds' shadow long, then breaking it when the beam tilted with the wind. No one spoke, no one explained. Only the wind, the tower, the lights, and the severed line in the hand of the one still alive. In the days following Noah's death, the camp became strange in a way no one spoke about. The formations were still perfectly aligned. The whistle still blew, but Boots still struck concrete. Pike still barked orders as loudly as ever, but no one came near Reynolds anymore. No one asked him anything, and no one looked at him for longer than a single beat. That silence did not come from fear of him, but from fear of being dragged into the same pit. One man falling was enough for the entire camp to realize there was an invisible line, and anyone who crossed it would become the next target. Wherever Reynolds appeared, the space around him seemed to part, forming a shapeless emptiness that was nonetheless easy to see. He did not care. Or rather, he had grown used to this kind of isolation decades ago, but something in the air made him realize that Noah's death was not an ending, but a spark. While he was being pushed to the edge of every gaze, an old name resurfaced: Caleb Rourke, a man who had stood in the middle of negotiations. Soldiers like Reynolds were never allowed to fully know. That afternoon, Reynolds left the camp through a side gate and walked to the only coffee shop within a mile. A small place. Dim, sparsely occupied, suited for conversation, but both sides wanted to keep silent. He chose a table near the window, the wooden surface worn smooth, his finger tracing the scratches, as if retracing an old route. When someone's shadow fell across the table, he looked up. Caleb Rourke sat down without shaking hands, without greeting, without any opening pleasantry. He placed both hands on the table, his gaze lowered, as if weighing the gravity of what he was about to say. "I didn't come to apologize." His voice carried no aggression, but it was clear and heavy, like a lead round set down on the table. Reynolds answered at once, without missing a beat. "I don't need one." His tone was level, neither high nor low, but there was something hard beneath it. Rourke inhaled, his lungs seeming to expand to hold things that had been compressed for too long. "Your team didn't die because of a mistake," Rourke said. His eyes bore the weight of an old truth. "They died to secure a deal." The words landed with such weight that even the clink of a spoon against a glass at the neighboring table became meaningless. Reynolds held his gaze steady, though no one could tell where inside him something had just broken. He did not ask why, did not ask who stood behind it, did not ask what deal. All of those questions were outer layers. The only thing he needed lay in the timing. When Reynolds asked, the word came out dry, like stone being ground. Rourke did not hesitate. "Before you entered the escape route, a fracture from the past ran straight through Reynolds. He felt the tabletop tilt slightly, even though it remained still. His breath caught for half a second before dropping back into his chest. He tilted his head just a fraction, as if trying to replay his own memory, to confirm whether he had truly given the order to take the shortcut. And if he had, a more terrible question surfaced. At once he had led them into death with his words. But those words, it turned out, had already been decided by others who had never set foot on the battlefield. Reynolds stood motionless, not from hesitation, but because his legs genuinely felt heavy. The cafe fell quiet, and in that sigh, he heard gunfire again. Voices calling out beneath forest canopies, cries swallowed when comrades fell, but now those sounds carried a different color, the color of being used. Rourke looked at him, then added, as if delivering a final blow, "You weren't betrayed, you were used." Reynolds blinked once, and something inside him shifted. Rourke's words were no longer information, but hot metal pressed against memories frozen solid. In that instant, he understood why the dust in the old warehouse had been swept clean, why the ambulance engine had been running that night, why Voss's gaze always lingered on his watch. Everything had been built long before Reynolds ever thought to ask questions. Rourke leaned back in his chair and added nothing more. He had said enough. Reynolds stood. The chair scraped back, its legs striking the floor with a dry, decisive sound. Reynolds left the cafe, pushing the wooden door open and letting the wind rush in behind him. Outside, the street was empty, the sun sinking lower, light cutting across his shoulders and stretching his shadow long across the ground. He walked a few steps, then stopped in the middle of the road, his hand clenched by reflex, then opened. Memory pulled him in two directions. One side held what he thought he had known. The other, the truth, just torn open. His legs felt as if they wanted to step in opposite directions at once. The road ahead was straight, but his mind split into countless branches. Reynolds closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the wind struck his face, colder than before, as if signaling something drawing near. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling deliberately, trying to pull back each fragment of memory spinning like screws in his head. Behind him, the cafe door closed. Ahead of him, a camp whistle sounded very faintly, just enough to remind him that what he had just heard was only the beginning of the truth. Night in the camp was longer and colder than any night before it, not because the weather had shifted, but because the silence after Noah's death clung to every wall, every walkway, every echoing footstep. Reynolds left the training field while the scene was still being cleared. The soft clink of metal against the medical vehicle, the crackle of radios, short and cold exchanges of words. He walked straight back to his temporary room, his steps steady but heavy. When he closed the door behind him, the room became too small to hold any breath. Not caught and held by memory, Reynolds switched on the desk lamp, the weak yellow light washing over the wall, forming shadows that would not stay still. He pulled a wooden box from under the bed, set it on the table, and opened it. Inside were only two things: a folding knife that had followed him through many campaigns, and an old file, the paper edges yellowed, the corners gnawed by rats. Reynolds took a map from the middle of the file, spread it on the floor, and weighted the corners with two small bricks. The map opened like an old wound, filled with faded pen marks, creases breaking the boundaries into jagged lines. The paper edges were so worn that every touch carried the sense that they might tear further. He knelt, bracing one hand on the floor, the other tracing the lines on the map with a calloused finger. Symbols, arrows, and pale color markings surfaced under the lamp's light. Reynolds did not need to read the legend. Everything had lived in his head for 30 years. Only one thing was different tonight. They appeared, not as tactics, but as underground currents running through memory. Two escape routes were marked. Route A curved along the hillside. Safer, slower. The pen mark there was clear, bold, and orderly. Route B was straight and short, cutting through a small valley. Few people knew. This route was marked with a thinner line, but the red circle around it was the sign of a decision made very quickly that night. Reynolds stared at Route B, his eyes unblinking for several seconds, long enough that he felt the blood pulsing in his head in rhythm with the time of the map itself. Memory did not erupt loudly. It arrived quietly, like a figure rising from the dark and standing just behind his shoulder. A low voice, tired but firm, his own voice, from 30 years earlier, sounded in his mind. Take the shortcut. Trust me. The last three words knocked inside him like three door strikes closing shut. That voice held no fire now, no confidence. It did not rise to command. It merely fell into place, as an inevitable choice, as if no other variation had existed. Reynolds reached for his glasses to see the small markings more clearly, but when his hand brushed his jacket pocket, his fingers met fabric still cold and damp from the night wind. He froze. His hand stopped in midair, as if he had forgotten what he was about to do. A small thing, very small, but enough to hold his entire body still for several seconds. He lowered his hand and did not take the glasses. He leaned his back against the wall, head lowered, and let out a long breath without sound, not breathing from fatigue, but from the weight of what had just surfaced in his mind. So heavy his chest had to expand to contain it. The map on the floor lay silent, but the lines on it seemed to stare straight at him. I led them into it. The sentence fell into the room. It did not echo, did not bounce. It felt like something soft but heavy, leaving an invisible mark of sound. No one heard it, but its weight was enough to make the room feel smaller to Reynolds. He lowered himself down and sat on the floor. The movement made no loud noise, but the way he let his body sink carried the sense that for the first time since this story began, his legs no longer wanted to keep him standing. Reynolds braced his hands behind him, back against the wall, head tilting slightly upward. He looked at the ceiling, the yellow light reflecting in his aging pupils. The map lay directly before him, Route B standing out like a wound that refused to close. A very long moment passed, not measurable by a clock. No one called his name. No one knocked. No footsteps outside. The room sank into a thick silence, the kind that exists only in places holding too many untold things. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them. The map was still there. Route B was still there. The old sentence still hung like an uncut wire. Reynolds reached out and touched the faded red circle. His hand trembled lightly for one beat, then stopped. He did not erase it, did not fold the map, did not push it away. He simply let his hand rest on the circle a little longer. Outside the small window of the room, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of a night whistle. Not loud, not urgent, but enough to pass through the walls and slip into the room. Reynolds opened his eyes and lifted his head toward the sound. It was the internal whistle, its tone different, not an alarm, but not the routine signal either. The whistle sounded again, longer this time, like a signal that something was moving out there. Reynolds looked at the map on the floor. Route B cut across the paper like a branch splitting through darkness. He placed his palm on it, paused for a beat, then drew his hand back. The whistle sounded a third time, longer and sharper. Reynolds rose slowly, both knees pressing into the floor, before he pushed himself up. He did not fold the map, nor did not put it back into the box. The paper lay open on the floor, the shortcut exposed under the pale yellow light, as if watching him walk away. He turned toward the door. Outside, the wind shifted direction again. The internal whistle wailed once more, colder, closer to the hour. Reynolds stopped in front of the door, his hand resting on the metal handle, not turning it yet. A very small pause opened up, then the night whistle outside stretched on for another beat. Not fast, not slow, just enough to know that something was coming. Night settled over the camp with a layer of silence heavier than the nights before. The wind blew in long waves, carrying the damp metallic smell from the western warehouse area. Reynolds left his room after hearing the internal whistle stretch across 3 beats, like a reminder that what he had seen, what he knew, could no longer remain inside that room. He crossed the yard, floodlights cutting across him, stretching his shadow long before breaking it apart with each gust. Noah had died the night before, and that death did not leave him for a single second. It felt as if a voice, carefully hidden beneath every sound, was urging him in one direction only. What Noah had left behind, a clue, a hesitant whisper before he fell, lay among the things this camp did not want anyone to dig up. Reynolds reached the old warehouse. The concrete walls, mottled with moss, reflected the dim light, as if they too had witnessed things never written into reports. He looked around, made sure no one was following, then walked to a corner of the yard where the ground was unnaturally compacted. That was where Noah had once stood looking down, where he had casually asked a question that stayed with Reynolds throughout that day. Reynolds crouched, brushed away the top layer of soil, and began to dig. The ground was cold and hard like stone, each thrust of his hands landing like repayments of debts accumulated over years. Each time his fingernails drove into the earth, a sharp pain ran from his fingertips up his arms, but Reynolds kept going. Soil stained his nails, clung to his knuckles, forming V dark streaks. When his nails split and bled, he did not stop. He only breathed harder, muttering word by word. Hurry! The wind blew hard, dusting soil across his face, but he did not wipe it away. His digging grew faster and faster, as if something beneath the ground were pulling his hands downward. Each time his fingers brushed a thinner layer of earth, his heart beat one notch harder. He heard every beat clearly, pounding inside like knocks on an old door. Then his fingernails scraped against the corner of something hard. Reynolds froze for half a second, then pushed the dirt aside. A rusted metal edge appeared, heavy in the soil like an object that did not want to be exposed. He dug faster, revealing the entire iron box, rusted in large patches, but still intact in shape. It was heavier than he expected, the earth seeming to hold it tight after so many years. He gripped both sides and hauled it up. His arms strained, soil spilling down with a dry, rustling sound. Reynolds set the box on the ground and breathed hard. He used his old folding knife to pry the lid open. Metal, letting out a thick, grinding sound like teeth clenched together. When the lid popped free, an old smell rose, damp paper and long-aged metal, the smell of things people tried to bury but never truly erased. Inside were cassette tapes, a stack of documents bound with brittle rubber bands, and several confirmation marks in ink that had bled and blurred. There was no apology letter, no explanation, nothing but the bare truth someone had once tried to bury. Reynolds lifted one tape, his hand heavy, as if holding a fragment of bone. He slid it into the small cassette player kept in the box and pressed play. Static crackled, then a voice surfaced from the depths of memory. Noah's voice. No, another voice. A man who had died on an earlier mission. Reynolds caught only a few words. Words he did not want to hear, did not want to remember. He shut the player off immediately. His finger left the stop button, trembling slightly. There was no time to delay further. He pulled an old phone from his jacket pocket, powered it on, and dialed Mara Klein. The call connected at once. Reynolds looked down at the box, the cold warehouse light reflecting off its rusted surface. "I have something you need," he said. Nothing more. Less than 5 minutes later, Mara emerged from the dark corridor. Her coat was pulled up to her neck, her breath still carrying the urgency of someone who had been running. She knelt beside Reynolds, glanced once around the area, then looked into the box. Her expression changed immediately. "Let me see," Mara said, her voice lowering on its own. Reynolds pushed the box closer. Mara opened the stack of papers, flipping through pages quickly, eyes scanning lines of text, ink marks, signatures, mission codes. She asked, no questions. There was no need. When she lifted the tape, the light struck the label, its writing smeared and faded. She turned to Reynolds. "If this is real, it will explode." Reynolds did not answer. He only looked at her, his gaze steady. Mara placed the tape back into the box as if setting down a danger waiting to ignite. She stood first, angling her body slightly toward the light in the yard. Reynolds pressed the lid shut with a firm motion, then stood. He held the iron box with both hands, as if carrying something that could fall and wake the entire camp if he did not keep the right angle. He looked toward the white lights shining from the distant training field. That was where everyone would see him if he stepped out. Reynolds drew in a long, even breath, then walked toward the light. His shadow stretched across the concrete, merging into the glare. Mara followed a few steps behind him, saying nothing, as if silence itself were the only way to keep the box from making a sound. Reynolds stepped onto the field. The lights shone directly onto his face, revealing every wrinkle, every hollow beneath tired eyes. He set the box down on a steel table near the assembly area, one hand still resting lightly on the lid. Wind swept through, lifting a thin line of dust from the box's surface. He did not pull his hand away. From the far end of the field, two figures appeared, walking toward him. The floodlights stretched their shadows long, merging them into one. Reynolds kept his hand on the lid, unmoving. Mara stood some distance away, her eyes fixed on the approaching shapes. For 1 second, the wind stopped completely. No footsteps, no metal, no night whistle, only the iron box lying in the middle of the field, like a spark, waiting for someone to touch it. The article was published on the quietest morning the camp had seen. So quiet that the first sound many people heard that day was the vibration of a phone notification on a wooden desk. There was no large headline, no sensational wording, just a few even lines, like the minutes of an emotionless meeting. Internal documents related to the death of the Black Ops team have been revealed. The wording was plain to the point of coldness. An image of the iron box, blurred and rusted, appeared beneath the headline like a witness summoned back after years of being forgotten. Excerpts from audio recordings, old confirmation marks, overlooked fragments of conversations, all were written in a way that made it impossible to accuse the reporter of exaggeration. Reynolds's phone rang continuously for the first 2 hours. Messages from unknown numbers, nameless calls, alerts that sounded briefly before being cut off midway. By noon, the ringing stopped completely, not because people had learned enough, but when the truth moves beyond the reach of a single unit, people tend to avoid those standing at its center. No one asked how he was holding up. No one sent condolences. A neat silence settled over him in the familiar way known to those who have passed through too many investigations without the sound of gunfire. The families of the soldiers in the Black Ops team received the news. There were no scenes of screaming in the yard, no pounding on doors, no arguments with duty officers. Some opened their doors to reporters, quietly read the printed pages, then closed the door again without saying a word. Doors shut, one house at a time, leaving thin slivers of light on the concrete ground. It was the silence of families who had waited for answers for 3 decades, and now that the answers had come, they carried a bitterness with nowhere to be released. Inside the camp, an emergency meeting was convened that same afternoon. Pike stood before a row of officers, the training board set on the table. He lowered his head as he spoke, his voice steady and clipped, as if reciting procedure. We followed protocol. 20 people in the room did not ask where that protocol came from, who had started it, or why it had not changed over such a long time. No one asked because everyone knew, but knowing and saying are two different things, and in that room, no one chose the second. When the information was confirmed, Voss was temporarily suspended. A press conference was held in front of the camp gate. He stepped out in a neatly pressed uniform, the fabric smooth as if it had never known a crack. Camera lights shone onto his face, revealing fine wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, but his expression did not change at all. No anger, no concern. He read exactly 3 prepared sentences, no more and no less, then stepped away from the podium. The microphones caught the sound of his footsteps as he left, heavy and decisive, like the ticking of the second hand on the watch he always touched. At the same time, Reynolds stood in front of the administrative gate, waiting for 2 military police officers to approach. He did not run. He did not hide. He stepped forward on his own, raising both hands in front of him, wrists turned toward them. The officer holding the cuffs paused slightly, as if surprised that Reynolds offered his hands so quickly, then clicked the cuffs shut. No one pushed him. No one grabbed his shoulder. Reynolds stepped into the vehicle himself, like a man boarding the exact transport he had known in advance he would use. On the way to the temporary holding area, Mara Klein walked beside him, a notebook in her hand. She did not look directly at Reynolds, her gaze fixed straight ahead as if counting each step in the corridor. When the vehicle stopped, she finally turned and asked, Do you regret it? Her voice was not as harsh in the article, but lower, as if the question weighed on her as well. Reynolds looked straight ahead at the life in front of him, not at Mara. I regret staying silent. The answer was short, but clear, like a door opening for a brief moment and closing itself again. Mara wrote it down and did not ask anything more. Her eyes dropped at the exact second the vehicle door opened for Reynolds to step into the detention area. The detention corridor was long and narrow, pale white neon lights hanging high above, the light falling like a cold streak. Reynolds walked past each cell, hearing metal vibrate softly as wire doors opened and closed with the air. When he stepped into his cell, the smell of damp cement struck his face, along with the familiar emptiness of places built to contain silence more than people. The steel door slid shut behind him. The sound of metal grinding into its track was heavy and slow. The guard said nothing. He simply locked the bolt and turned away. Light from the corridor filtered through the small window, casting part of Reynolds' face in pale illumination. He sat down on the concrete bench, hands resting on his knees, back straight, eyes still fixed on the door, following the moving streaks of light on the wall as the guard walked. A sound echoed from the far end of the corridor, not loud, but enough to make Reynolds lift his head slightly. Footsteps approached slowly, unhurried, not sharp. Each step seemed measured. Light stretched the shadow of the figure, moving toward his cell. The guard stopped in the middle of the corridor and turned his head toward that shadow. Reynolds did not stand. He looked straight ahead. The figure stopped a short distance from the barred window, the overhead light obscuring the face for a few seconds. Then the figure shifted one step forward, just enough to reveal a shoulder and an arm. The sound of a metal lock rang out somewhere at the end of the corridor, repeating in another rhythm. The figure outside the cell remained standing still. Time in the holding cell did not move like a clock in the outside world. It was not counted in minutes or hours, but in breaths, and in the moments when Reynolds opened his eyes to look at the ceiling, and then closed them again. Light from the small window above cut down in a straight strip, changing in density with the time of day, but never clearly enough to say today was different from yesterday. He sat alone in the empty cell, his back against the wall, counting the cracks that twisted like dry roots across the concrete surface. Some ran deep, some had appeared only recently. Reynolds traced one long crack with his finger, running from the base of the wall almost to the ceiling, as if using that line to measure himself, to see how many segments had already broken. There was no interrogation. No officer came in to take notes. No one asked him about the iron box, and no one asked who had given the order. Each meal slid through the slot in the door. Reynolds lifted it, ate a few bites, then set it down again. The guards did not look inside, and he did not look out. His cell felt like a locked drawer, used to temporarily store an object they did not know where to place in the large house of the camp. One morning, a key turned. Reynolds was sitting, both hands resting on his knees. He did not startle, did not stand right away. The guard appeared behind the bars, carrying no file, no papers. He pulled the bolt, and the door opened with a long metallic slide in its track, a sound so cold it nearly split the air in two. "Go," the guard said. The voice was neither commanding and not friendly. It sounded like a sentence practiced for years. Exactly one word, exactly one tone, exactly one function. Reynolds stood. He smoothed his shirt by instinct, then walked toward the door. As he passed the guard, the man stepped aside half a pace to make space for him to pass, not out of respect or fear. Reynolds moved down the long corridor, white neon light washing over his face in segments. The walls on both sides bore old paint streaks, faint handprints from someone who had leaned there before. He did not look for long. Each footstep sounded sharply, echoing back from both sides like two parallel shadows walking with him. When he reached the camp gate, natural light struck his eyes directly. Reynolds narrowed them slightly, then adjusted. The iron gate opened. Wind rushed in, carrying the smell of dry earth and engine oil. No officer stood waiting. No handshake. No apology. No release papers. No acknowledgement that he had stepped out of a story this place wanted to forget. The camp released him the way one lets go of an object to lighten the load. Outside the gate, someone was waiting. Kyle Mercer. He stood about 10 steps from the gate, hands clasping together, then loosening, then tightening again. His jacket was slightly wrinkled at the shoulders, as if he had been standing there for a long time. When Reynolds drew closer, Kyle took a deep breath, his hands shaking, but he did not step forward. "Sir," Kyle began, then stopped. The last word vanished in his throat. He lowered his gaze, taking a few seconds to find his voice again. Then he reached into his chest of pocket and pulled out a small object, a folding knife. The silver casing was scratched, the hinge slightly loose, fingerprints still marked along the spine. He raised both hands and extended them toward Reynolds, as if returning a fragment of memory that did not belong to him. "Noah kept it for you," Kyle said. His voice was hoarse, not from the wind, but from the weight lodged in his throat. I kept it for Noah. Reynolds looked at the knife. He looked for a long time. Light struck the metal, revealing the fine scratches. Clearly, he reached out and took hold of it, but did not pull it away. His thumb rested on the spine for one beat, the cold of the metal traveling from his fingertips straight up his arm. He looked at Kyle, eyes aged but not soft. Reynolds pushed the knife back. The motion was light, but firm. Keep it, he said. His voice was low, dry, but steady. If you want redemption, live, decently. Kyle drew in a sharp breath, as if the words had drilled straight into his chest. He nodded, eyes reddening. A second later, he turned his face away to hide the emotion rising too quickly, then turned back to Reynolds, unable to speak. A thank you, not because he forgot, but because saying it would make everything harder to hold together. Reynolds turned his back to the camp gate. No one saw him off. No one watched. No one stood as a witness. Wind blew sand low across the road, the sound of his shoes grinding on gravel clear in the quiet morning. Behind him, the camp gate slowly closed, releasing a heavy sound, like a bunker door sealing after someone had stepped out of darkness into a place not quite brighter, but wider. Reynolds walked a few more steps, then paused for half a second, not to look back, but to look straight ahead. The road was long and straight, with no signs pointing the way. What he had done, said, and endured, was only a part of something larger, a cycle he had just stepped out of, and also a cycle he knew would continue even after he left it. Somewhere beyond the garage area, an engine started, the sound flaring for a beat, then cutting off abruptly, as if someone had changed their mind. The wind carried the sound away, leaving behind a dense silence. At the end of the road ahead, something had just moved. Reynolds left the camp gate with steps that were steady but not light. There was no line of people seeing him off, no greeting from the duty officer, no stamped paper proving he had paid a price that someone in the system had deemed reasonable. There was only the long pull of wind across the open ground, blowing past light poles thin as bones, carrying the smell of iron and old dust left behind after a long week. He pulled his collar up a little higher, not because of the cold, but because a body long confined indoors forgets what it feels like to have real wind fill the chest. After a few dozen meters, he stopped to take a breath not wrapped in military discipline, not pressed tight by concrete walls, but open, as if he had just stepped up from a basement into open air. When he looked to the right, where the corner of the medical area yard appeared under the fresh morning light, he saw it, the old ambulance, the same model, the same paint color, the same position as on the night Noah died. It sat there like an object not yet returned to the garage, like something forgotten, as there had never been floodlights turned on in the night. Waiting for a body, Reynolds stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly, not because of the sun, but because memory came back suddenly with unannounced weight. A maintenance worker was bent down by the rear door of the vehicle, a medium-built man, broad-shouldered, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He held a cloth and a bottle of cleaning solution, wiping the door one line at a time, meticulous enough to make it seem as if he were dealing with a stain not permitted to exist. Each stroke was firm, strong, and repeated 3 times along the exact same path. The sound of fabric scraping metal rang dry, as paper rubbed against wood. Reynolds stood still, following the movement, clearly seeing how the worker rotated the cloth, folded it to use a clean section, then continued wiping, careful as if erasing the history of the vehicle itself. Reynolds tightened his palm slightly, a small movement, but distinct. His knuckles drew together, skin pulling into a thin crease. Then he relaxed. The wind passed at the exact moment his hand opened, lifting away the moisture, still clinging to his coat hook. He turned his face halfway, as if to keep walking, but an uncomfortable pressure somewhere in his chest held him there for exactly 1 beat. A very short beat, but enough for him to know that inside this camp, the truth was not something you could break once and then leave alone. It was a crack, and every touch called back the sound of old fractures. Reynolds gave one last brief look toward the ambulance. The worker was still wiping, focused, not even noticing someone watching. The rear door, which had once been left slightly open that night, now lay still and spotless under the cloth. No faint handprints, no clinging dust, no dark seam holding secrets, as if the vehicle had never idled all night, never waited for a body to fall from the tower, never been part of someone's arranged plan. He turned and walked on. Without looking back, there was no need to look again, because what needed to be seen had been seen enough. Wind rolled across the wide yard, carrying dry grass fragments and the sound of someone's footsteps far away. As Reynolds moved closer to the training area, he heard the morning whistle sound, sharp, clean, perfectly timed, just as it had been for years. Inside the yard, a new group of recruits stood lined up. They stood straight, shoulders tight, backs stiff, shoes placed along the white painted lines like copies quickly produced from a single mold. Their faces still held youth, confidence, and the innocence not yet tested. In the early sunlight, their white t-shirts glowed, making the formation look like a board with nothing written on it yet. Reynolds stood a few steps away, observing them as if observing himself from many years earlier, and also seeing within that formation the shadows of those who had once gone on missions with him. Everything repeated. The posture, the breathing rhythm, the eyes trying to hide tension. Nothing was new. Nothing had grown old. The machine kept running. Then his gaze stopped at the end of the line. A recruit, not tall enough to stand out, not small enough to disappear. He stood still, his back not perfectly straight, one hand slightly curled as if hiding something in a pocket. He did not speak, did not look around, did not lean forward to prove himself. When the wind brushed past, the hem of his shirt fluttered lightly, revealing a sliver of silver metal near the left chest pocket. Reynolds looked closer. An old folding knife. The light reflecting off its scuffed casing made it recognizable, even though only a small corner showed. The recruit lightly touched his pocket by reflex, not simply adjusting the object inside. The gesture resembled someone acknowledging the weight of a message entrusted to him, not yet spoken aloud. Reynolds did not step closer. He only watched from a distance, his eyes never leaving the recruit's hand as it dropped, then tightened slightly. The wind shifted direction, sweeping across the yard, making the name tags on the recruit's shirts tremble. Reynolds inhaled, the breath going strangely deep into his lungs, as if he were about to say something and then decided not to. Everything in that moment fell still. The morning whistle had just faded. The instructor's footsteps had not yet sounded, and the recruits remained frozen, ready to enter the first drill of a day they did not yet know how it would consume them. Reynolds looked at the formation, then turned away. No one knew he had been standing there. No one asked why he was at the gate at this hour. He walked on, his shoes crushing a small piece of gravel, the sound dry and distinct, like a marker placed between what had happened and what was preparing to repeat. Behind him, synchronized footsteps rang out as Pike appeared and barked orders for the recruits to adjust formation. The sound struck the yard like metal hitting the ground, sharp and cold, exactly the kind of sound a system designed never to stop turning would produce. Reynolds took a few more steps. The wind pushed his coat to one side, carrying with it a familiar smell from the camp, the smell of a place that always knows how to bury what needs burying, erase what needs erasing, and preserve its rotation. He paused for half a beat. Another whistle sounded, not loud, its purpose unclear, but timed and shaped exactly like ones he had heard many times in his life, just enough to know that the rotation had not stopped, and that it was not yet someone else's turn to touch the brake. Reynolds' story is not only about a veteran standing against an unjust system, but also a powerful reminder that silence can sometimes kill more effectively than the battlefield itself. Noah died in a staged accident, but the root of the tragedy was decades of silence, closed doors, and ambulances always waiting, with no one daring to ask why they were there. Reynolds thought he was merely an old cog in a vast machine, but in the end, he understood one thing clearly. If no one stands up, that machine will grind down many more lives. The lesson is not meant only for the military, but for any collective. When wrongdoing is concealed behind procedure, when people are treated as replaceable objects, and when an entire group accepts silence, tragedy will repeat itself. Each person bears the responsibility of keeping a small flame alive, so that the truth is not erased. If this story made you reflect, share it so others can learn from it as well. Thank you for following until the end. I commit to bringing you content of the highest quality and depth. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel to see more meaningful and inspiring stories.